The International Monetary Fund has issued its regular economic outlook, and according to the new report, a subdued and uneven recovery is projected for the countries of Central Asia and Caucasus. According to the new economic outlook, Kazakhstan's GDP will grow 3.3% in 2021. That is a 1/10 percentage point upgrade since April. The IMF has also revised its inflation rate forecast for this year from the previous 6.4% to 7.5%. The International Financial Institution has lowered its economic outlook for Kazakhstan's GDP growth in 2022 to 3.9% from the previously forecasted 4%. The inflation rate is expected to stay between 5 to 6.5% in 2022. One of the leading economists of the IMF, Mr. Jihad Azour, joins me from Washington, D.C. to discuss the new economic forecast. Mr. Azour, thank you for joining. Now, oil exporters in the Central Asia and Caucasus region had a double economic impact caused by the lockdown measures, but also a sharp decline in oil prices in 2020. However, this year we're seeing oil prices picking up and also global oil demand growing and forecast to grow by another 1 million barrels per day, according to the International Energy Agency. With all that in mind, what is the economic outlook, the short-term economic outlook for the oil exporters in the region?
Well, thank you very much for having me. The crisis last year was very difficult, the double whammy shock, as you mentioned. Countries in the region have reacted very rapidly by introducing a certain number of measures to protect lives, but also through fiscal and monetary measures to protect the various sectors in the economy. In addition to that, the rapid and massive vaccination that certain countries like Kazakhstan have introduced very early on in this year helped to accelerate the recovery. Therefore, we expect this year that growth will be positive. And for example, in the case of Kazakhstan, will be at a level of 3.3% this year, compared to a negative growth of 2.6% last year. Of course, improvement in oil price is a positive news. It will help address some of the issues that emerged last year. Policies that were introduced in order to reduce the impact of the shock on the various sectors were welcomed and helped give a floor to the economy. We expect that gradually those measures will be unwinded, and when recovery consolidates or strengthens, we expect that the medium-term consolidation will start. In addition to that, the various policies that were introduced on the monetary and the financial sector side also were welcomed and went into the right direction, allowed Kazakhstan and countries in the region to address the risk of inflation. Some central banks have resorted to increase in interest rate in order to maintain the anchoring of expectation on inflation.
Mr. Azour, you started talking about inflation, and the inflation rate has galloped away. Kazakhstan saw a 14% food inflation, a record level in the recent years. The headline inflation rate has been high and is growing for almost all countries of the region, and this is caused by both domestic and global factors. What should higher inflation tell our viewers? Could you please help us make sense of it?
Well, inflation is a global phenomenon that was driven by a sharp increase in food prices, as well as also the result of the disruption in supply chain. However, we expect that this increase in prices that peaked in 2021 will gradually decline in 2022 and onward. Of course, this requires in the short term to address any impact of this sharp increase in prices and avoid that this increase in inflation will lead into also deterioration in other macroeconomic issues. Therefore, the policies that were introduced so far in order to maintain inflation under control using monetary and as well as also fiscal policy are the steps that goes in the right direction. Going forward, what is important is to accelerate the recovery and to have a transformational recovery that allows key sectors in the economy to grow, especially benefiting from the silver linings that we saw during the crisis. For example, technology, green economy are important sectors for the future. And this is where we recommend to accelerate structural reforms, reform state-owned enterprises, increase competitiveness of the economy, and also address the issue of informality.
Mr. Azour, now one of the IMF's recommendations for the oil exporters in the region is using the increased oil revenues to focus on the long-term transformational changes. But even pre-pandemic, the countries in the region lags behind their peers in terms of infrastructure, human capital, and SME development, given the large role played by state enterprises. How do we rethink the role of the state and strengthen private sector going forward?
Well, it's an important issue to charter the future. And if you take the example of Kazakhstan, the government has put in place, in addition to the various measures to address the crisis, stabilize the economy and accelerate the recovery, but also there is a long-term strategy now that looks at what are the priorities of the future, how to reposition the Kazakhstan economy to play a leading role in the region and to be part of the new framework in terms of globalization. Those are the steps in the right direction. They require to maintain macroeconomic stability and address the issues that surfaced with the crisis, avoid having scarring to the economy, make sure that the financial sector entered the crisis on strong footing with a high level of capitalization and strong liquidity will remain the engine of growth and financing to the economy, but also to focus on the new set of reforms, improve the quality of labor and address the risk of scarring on the labor market, help the corporate sector, but also invest in future industries. Technology is one, digital is another one that are related, but also climate and climate activities are going to be one of the key drivers of recovery in Kazakhstan, but also in the region.
Mr. Azour, what role do you think curbing corruption play in the recovery for the countries in the region?
Well, as you know, the fund has been working on those issues and promoting the importance of good governance. And we have issued recently two important studies. One is on the governance of SOEs, in particular the corporate governance and the relationship with the state, but also another study that assessed and provided recommendations on how to improve broad governance, fight corruption, and strengthen the role of ministries of finance and central banks in addressing those issues. Those are important issues because they are at the heart of confidence between citizen and state. Those are important issues too because they allow the economy to be more competitive, provide even-handedness for investors, but also improve business climate. And this is why we believe that investing in strengthening institutions, investing in fighting corruption, and also provide predictability to economic and financial policy, those are important dimensions in accelerating the recovery and making the recovery more inclusive.
Now let's talk about other countries in the region consistent with global trends. Merchandise trade returned to its pre-pandemic level. Tourism has picked up. However, remittances remain crucial for the economies in the region like Georgia, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. How do you think these countries are faring in the second year of the pandemic?
Well, the recovery is underway in the region, and after a contraction that we saw last year, we see positive growth. However, there are a certain number of important issues to highlight here. One, the issue of vaccination. There is still certain diversity and divergence in terms of vaccination. Vaccination is very important to accelerate the recovery, as well as also to help countries recover in sectors that were affected, like tourism, high contact intensive sectors. In addition to that, certain countries were not able to provide the same level of fiscal and monetary support, and those countries will recover slowly compared to the others. Three is the disruption that came with the global movement. The increase in prices, risk of inflation also affected some of the countries in the region. The positive that we are seeing in the region is there is now an opportunity to grow intra-regional trade, increase regional integration, and with countries who are in the leading position like Kazakhstan, like Uzbekistan, we believe that the region can accelerate growth. Of course, this required to maintain macroeconomic stability, and this is where we are encouraging countries to gradually move from the fiscal support and monetary support that was provided, and as soon as the recovery is strengthening, start to normalize, and in the medium term to consolidate public finance in order to recreate buffers.
Now, according to the latest IMF paper, swift vaccination should be the major short-term policy for the countries in the region, and the goal is to reach a 40% of the populations inoculated before the end of this year and 60% of the populations vaccinated in the beginning of 2022. And of course, a strong regional but also international cooperation will be required to achieve these targets. Now, what will happen if the countries fail to achieve these targets?
Well, vaccination is an important priority, and it's a global priority. It should be one of the main policies that we should globally work together to achieve, and this is the message of the fund. And for that purpose, as you know, the fund last year provided the rapid facility to help countries address the COVID shock, and among the first who benefited were countries from Caucasus and Central Asia, like, for example, Kyrgyz Republic, but was not the only one. Several other countries benefited, Tajikistan, Georgia, Armenia, and other countries. This year, with the SDR allocation, we hope that this will be used in certain cases to increase reserves, but also in other cases to help address the issue of vaccination. Vaccination is regional and international priority, and we encourage countries to accelerate that. And we saw that countries who have accelerated recently were able to curb the new wave that we saw in the summer, the Delta wave. And we also are encouraged by the fact that many countries now have been diversifying their supply of vaccines, and their plan of vaccinations have been now becoming more forthcoming on that issue.
Mr. Azour, the impact of the pandemic has been uneven across certain groups. The low-skilled, the youth, women and migrant workers have been affected the most. Youth and women unemployment declined 6% and 10% respectively in 2020, and that was higher than for men and the total adults. What are some of the long-term implications of this?
Well, this is a very important issue, and we have in our report this year highlighted the importance of that. We studied the impact of the crisis on the labor market, especially on the most vulnerable groups, women, youth, and some of the migrant workers. Those are the most affected. And the scarring of the economy may take years to bring us back to the trajectory that we had prior to the COVID crisis. The way to address it is through maintaining when it's possible and when it's needed, the support to the economy, and targeted further to help those who are in vulnerable positions, youth, women, and also allow for rehabilitation of workers through capacity development and training. Second, structural reforms. Structural reforms are very important because this is the way we can recover faster level of growth, create new jobs, and allow especially small and medium-sized companies to grow again. Last but not the least, I think it's important to preserve macroeconomic stability. Macroeconomic stability proved to be very important and I would say critical. Addressing the risk of inflation and its implications, especially socially, maintain access to market, preserve macroeconomic stability are all of them very important elements. And countries who have succeeded in having strong financial system, good buffers, were able to recover fast and also to limit the impact of the crisis on their economy.
Mr. Azour, unemployment remains a major challenge for the countries in the region, more so for some countries than the others. To sort of unemployment stabilizing growth needs to be higher than 8% for some countries, which means that at the current rate or the projected growth rate, the economies will not be able to create enough jobs to sort of to offset unemployment. What should the immediate policy response to that be?
Well, the solution is clear. They need 8% if they don't do reforms. But if they do reforms, if they increase their competitiveness, and also if they invest in the industries of the future, as we are recommending, investing in green economy, in technology, increasing through right investment in infrastructure, the attractiveness of the economies in the region, and become, instead of being a corridor, becoming a platform in the new value chains, will allow countries to accelerate their recovery, but also to have a job-rich recovery, an inclusive recovery. One of the lessons of this crisis is informality did not help as a buffer during this crisis because of the nature of the crisis. And therefore, also here, we need to modernize the social system, provide through training, investment in education, the capacity for the young generation to accelerate its contribution, and also the rehabilitation of skills to allow the economies of the region to grow faster. This is what, in certain cases, showed the difference and the resilience that some countries were able to witness even during this double whammy shock that countries experienced in the crisis.
Mr. Azour, the IMF has championed an inclusive growth agenda for the region in the recent years, and looking beyond immediate recovery, but also amid some of the increased geopolitical threats, including a regime change in Afghanistan, what are you most hopeful about in terms of the region's potential in the next decade?
Well, of course, there are certain number of geopolitical developments that have impact on neighboring countries. You raised the issue of Afghanistan recently. This is something that we are closely monitoring, as well as also monitoring the impact of this crisis on neighboring countries. Risks are of additional pressure in terms of labor, on other countries' refugees, and also disruption in trade. The answer for that is additional effort in order to increase the level of inclusion in different countries, reduce the risks, and increase cooperation. This region has a future because it has a young population, well educated, was able to go through one of the most challenging crises of the recent history and survive. I think the new global trends will allow the region to increase its attractiveness. We see new trade routes. We see also new forms of value chains. And this is where we believe investing in the future, increasing the stability of the macroeconomy, increase the level of cooperation, are avenues that could help individually, but also the region recover fast.
Mr. Azour, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.